Acts chapter 11, verse 26. And in Antioch, the disciples were first called Christians. Now, as you know, the earliest followers of Jesus were Jews, primarily living in Jerusalem. But around 34 AD, about a year after Jesus rose, there was a terrible persecution that broke out against the Jewish believers living in Jerusalem. And so they ended up having to scatter. They had to go out, and they brought the gospel with them. And so Christian communities started forming in many Gentile territories. And one of those places was called Antioch. It was a Greek city, and there a vibrant community of Jesus followers took root. And as this group of Jesus followers began growing in Antioch, it could not escape the notice of the Greco-Roman community there. Now, what stood out to the Greco-Roman culture about these Jesus followers is that everything they taught and everything they believed about the world and even about themselves was all wrapped up in a singular man, Jesus Christ of Nazareth. Jesus was the group's singular, most defining feature. They claimed that this Jesus was not simply a teacher or a leader or an innovator, but rather that he was the God of Judaism who had come down in the flesh, that he had sacrificed himself in the place of sinners so that everyone who trusts in him will be saved from God's wrath. They taught that Jesus had defeated death and rose again, and that everyone who trusts in him will also rise again and have everlasting life. Jesus taught that the lowly and the meek and the humble would inherit the earth, that the ultimate sign of godliness was not your power or your pomp or your authority, but humility before God, that his followers must devote themselves to his teachings and follow his example. So from start to finish, this odd group in Antioch, from start to finish, from front to back, was all about Jesus, about the Christ. And so as kind of an insult, they started calling this Jesus group Christians, kind of making fun of them because everything about them centers around this person of Jesus Christ. But instead of rejecting that and taking it as an insult, these believers in Antioch agreed. And they said, yes, everything about us revolves around Jesus. We welcome the name. And so they adopted it as their own. And the reason why this is so important is because at the very center of apologetics is the person and work of Jesus Christ. Without Jesus, there is no Christianity. There might still be a God. There might still be a higher power. There might even be a theistic divine power somewhere. But you don't have biblical Christianity. If there is no Jesus, if Jesus is not who the Gospels say he is, then the whole tower of Christianity collapses in a heap. And the apologetic for Jesus is actually really neat because if we can affirm who Jesus is, we actually get every other branch of apologetics thrown in. If Jesus is who the Gospels say he is, and if Jesus really did what the Gospels say he did, then that means that God is real, miracles can and have happened, the Old Testament scriptures are truly from God because Jesus affirmed them, and the New Testament scriptures are truly from God because they are from Christ's appointed apostles. You get Jesus, you get everything else included. So if there was one lecture I wanted, which is kind of funny because I think tonight's the smallest night we've had the whole class. If there was one lecture I wanted everybody in the class to hear, it would be this one. Because if you get Jesus, you get everything else we're going to cover thrown in. This is quite possibly the most important topic because Jesus is at the center of Christianity. So there's several things we're going to look at tonight. And the first is this, the trustworthiness of the biblical Gospels. Last week, we considered the trustworthiness of the New Testament in general. I want to zoom in a little bit on the Gospels in particular, because if the Gospels are indeed trustworthy information about Jesus, then there's good reason to believe what they report about Jesus. So a couple things we'll look at there. First is we're going to revisit this idea of eyewitness testimony. Last week, we talked about the importance of eyewitness testimony, how critical it is. So let's examine the four Gospel authors and see how eyewitness testimony played a role in what they wrote. Well, Matthew, also called Levi, he was one of the 12 apostles. So he was there almost from the beginning. He saw this happen. Now, we talked last week about how some people will say, well, Matthew's name isn't actually attached to the gospel, so we don't know if he actually wrote it. It could have been somebody else later who threw Matthew's name on there. I think there's a couple reasons we can reject that. A big important reason is because the attestation that Matthew was the author actually comes very early. There was a church father named Papias who wrote around the year 100 that Matthew was indeed the author of this gospel. And Matthew is cited in the early church, and it's always attributed to Matthew. There was never any other potential author in the early church. There was never a dispute or an argument. From the earliest writings we have, it was always assumed that it was Matthew who wrote his gospel. What about Mark? We talked last week about how Mark was possibly present for some of the events of the gospel. It's possible that he was the young man who ran away naked in the Garden of Gethsemane, but we do know he was definitely there for some of the events in Acts. We also know that Mark was validated by Peter. Peter called Mark a son of his, a spiritual son, and we know that he had for a while an up and down relationship with Paul, but by the end of his life, Paul said that Mark was very, very dear and valuable to him in ministry. So Mark was possibly present during some of the gospel events, definitely present during some of Acts events, and was attested to by both Paul and Peter. We have a similar attestation from that same papyrus, I almost said papyrus, Papias, around 100. We also have testimony from Church Father Irenaeus around 180 AD, and then a couple others there, Clement of Alexandria, late 2nd, early 3rd century. All of these early writers affirmed that Mark got his gospel information from Peter, that the apostle eyewitness Peter would preach and teach and share about his encounters with Jesus, and Mark became the interpreter, that is the one who wrote down what Peter said. So there's very good early attestation that Mark actually wrote down Peter's eyewitness experiences. And there's a couple other evidences for this as well. So when we went through the Gospel of Mark at Darby a couple years ago, I went through and I found what's amazing is there is no other character in that gospel except for Peter whose personal memories are talked about. There's several passages where it talks about Peter remembered such and such, and that's not true of any other character. Now, you do see this in Matthew's gospel as well, but remember, we said Matthew probably based his off of what Mark wrote first. So it makes sense if Mark's getting his information from Peter, there's some personal recollections in there. That's not true of any other character. Another similarity we see is that in Acts chapter 10, Peter gives this gospel presentation of the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And the structure of Peter's sermon is almost identical with the outline of Mark's gospel. So it adds kind of some validation here that Mark's getting his information from Peter. And Peter's eyewitness testimony is significant because he was kind of like Jesus' right-hand guy. In fact, Peter himself said in 2 Peter 1:16, "We did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty." So Mark got his information from one of the chief characters who was right in the middle of it. What about Luke? Luke was a beloved traveling companion of Paul. He was by Paul's side through a lot of different adventures. We talked last week about some of those passages in Acts where it refers to we. We got on a ship, we landed. Who is the we? It's first-person perspective from Luke, who was right there in the midst of it. Now, even though Luke didn't personally witness the gospel events, he did pen his gospel after doing a thorough investigation and interview process with other eyewitnesses. So he says in Luke chapter 1, opening passage, he says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught." So Luke is saying, all right, guys, these were things that were done among us. Like, you guys, this was not ancient history. The things that I'm writing about that Jesus said and did happened in the midst of a whole bunch of people who are still alive. And what I'm writing to you now is an organized account based on eyewitness testimony of people who were there. And as we also discussed last week, I think there's very good reason to believe that Luke's gospel was written, was circulating, and was already regarded as scripture by the mid-60s. If you want a recap of that, go back and read last week's notes. All right, what about John? John was also one of the 12 apostles. He was one of the very first disciples to follow Jesus. He was part of kind of an inner core. Jesus would be with the 12, and then sometimes he would go off and would have special powwow times with Peter, James, and John. So John was in that exclusive circle. He was especially close with Jesus. He was referred to as the disciple that Jesus loved. So they had a very special friendship connection there. After Christ's death, it was John who took care of Mary, Jesus' mother. He became sort of an adopted son to her. He was regarded as a pillar of the early church. And John would often emphasize his own eyewitness testimony. He says at the end of his gospel, this is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things. guys, I'm not just writing you a story, I'm recounting what I lived through. He said in 1 John chapter 1, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon and have touched with our hands. He says, we have seen it and we testify it to you. Now, in recent years, it's been very popular to claim that John not only did not write the gospel, but somebody else wrote the Gospel of John much, much later, maybe end of the 1st century, possibly even beginning of the 2nd century. Excuse me. If that were the case, that would make the Gospel of John not a valid source of eyewitness testimony. But there's a very big problem with this theory, and that is that within John's Gospel, he includes very specific information about some of the layout of Jerusalem. So there's several pools that he talks about, some other things about the city and the streets and the way that certain things are set up. The reason why nobody could have written this later is because Jerusalem was totally wiped out in 70 AD. And there wasn't like a record of this stuff kept that somebody could go look up at the library. The only person who could have known this information about Jerusalem prior to 70 AD is someone who was there. Now, here's what adds credibility to John, because in recent years, archaeological digs have uncovered some of these sites John's gospel talks about. So it could not have been somebody writing it the end of the 1st century or beginning of the 2nd century who hadn't been in Jerusalem prior to 70 AD. So that lends a lot of credibility, I think, to this idea that John was an eyewitness there in
Yes and
Jerusalem.
no.
Let's see. Pastor Chris, I think your microphone is on, brother. Okay. All right. Another thing we want to consider is how the 4 Gospels are independent but complementary sources of information. Now, a skeptic will point out to you, not all 4 Gospels share the same information. And it's true. If you compare them all side by side, you see some of them have nearly identical information and stories. Some of them have similar information, but with some varying details. And some of them have totally unique information that you won't find in the others. And so for these reasons, you'll often hear one of 2 criticisms about the Gospels. Either one, they're too similar. They copied off each other's homework. Or number 2, they're too different, and therefore they contradict each other. But the skeptic can't have it both ways. You got to pick one and stick with it. Is your problem that they're too similar, or is your problem that they're too different from each other? And I would actually argue that the fact that we see strong similarities and a variety of differences actually testifies to their legitimacy. I think that adds a bit of realism to the fact that these are 4 different accounts about the same event, but from 4 different sources. If there were 4 separate accounts about the same person drawn on a variety of sources, we should expect that there would be some information that's identical, some information that's diverse. Because if all the information was too similar, if like you just read the Gospels and every single line was the exact same, we would have reason to suspect the fix was on. But if there was nothing similar about them whatsoever, and they were totally irreconcilable, then we would assume that there's too many contradictions, and who knows what's true and what's not. What we have in the Gospels is 4 extremely similar accounts, but with just enough variety and detail to, I think, testify to the fact that it got this same information from different people, different sources. In fact, that's exactly what you find whenever you have different people reporting on the same incident. And what adds to some of this distinction is that each gospel author seems to have a particular emphasis he's really trying to show us about Jesus. So, for example, Matthew's big emphasis is that Jesus is the promised Messiah that the Old Testament talks about. Now, the other 3 authors draw attention to that, but it seems to be what Matthew is really, really focused on. So there are multiple passages and quotations of the Old Testament, incidents from Jesus' life that Matthew includes because it's part of supporting his thesis that the other gospel authors maybe aren't as concerned to show us. John's gospel, for example, is concerned with showing that Jesus is the divine Son of God. So John includes stories and teaching material from Jesus that the other gospel authors maybe don't include, because John wants to show, more than almost anything, Jesus is the divine Son of God. Now, I want to give you guys an example of how this works and how I think this actually affirms the gospel. So let's use an analogy. Let's say it was my wedding day. So that was, how long ago? Almost 12 years now. And I asked for 4 different written accounts of my wedding day. Okay? I wanted 4 written accounts of the big day. So 2 of the writers were guests who would actually be physically present. They could draw on their own eyewitness testimony, but they could also eyewitness other guests who were there as well. And so they have kind of this collaboration of their own experience plus interviewing other guests who were there as well. The other two writers did not attend the wedding. Sorry, I like you, but not that much. They did not attend the wedding, but what they could do is they could then go and interview the guests who were there. Okay? Now add another aspect to it. Let's say each writer was trying to emphasize a certain aspect of the wedding. Maybe the theme of the first writer was romantic love. So the stories that he's going to be selecting, the reactions he's going to be trying to capture, the parts of the speech he's going to be highlighting would all be trying to draw out this theme of romantic love at the wedding. Somebody else might be trying to emphasize family. So there's going to be a big emphasis on the siblings or the grandmothers or the first dance, or not the first dance, but like the daddy-daughter dance or something like that. He's going to be focusing on family. One might be celebration. So you've got to focus on how everybody's dressed up or the music or the party aspect. And somebody else might be focusing on beauty. So there's going to be a lot of attention devoted to the flower arrangements or the perfect cake or the bride. Now, how would these four accounts all compare with each other? We would expect there to be many of the same details. In fact, if there weren't some of the same details, we'd think you guys were probably all talking about 4 different weddings. We would expect and we would need certain details to be the same. But even within the same stories, we would expect there to be a variety of detail with different emphasis, and we would expect certain details to appear in some accounts, not in others. All that is precisely what we have in the Gospels, which I think adds to their credibility as 4 independent, complementary sources of information about Jesus. And in 2 weeks, when we talk about objections to Christianity, we'll talk about a few of the supposed contradictions in the gospel. And we'll actually examine how they're not contradictions at all. All right, another aspect we can consider is early recognition by the church. Remember, we're talking about the 4 gospels as accurate sources of information about Jesus, and we can look at the early recognition by the church. It's sometimes contested that there were a whole bunch of gospels of Jesus floating around in the early church, and one particular group of Christians kind of just picked the 4 that they liked best. Maybe you've heard something like that before. There were just a whole bunch of biographies about Jesus, and the 4 that we have survived because kind of this powerful inner core of Christians decided these are the ones that we like. And so you only get one particular perspective of Jesus. Now, it's true, there were many early testimonies about Jesus. That's where Luke got his information from. But there is zero historical evidence that there were a bunch of competing gospels. There's just a whole bunch of gospels that were all sharing different versions of Jesus with each other. In fact, here's 4 good reasons why we can trust the 4 biblical gospels as the best and most accurate sources of information. First, they were all written in the 1st century. Now, last week we talked about how some people will try to say, they were all written later 1st century, between 70 to 90 AD. I disagree. I think they were probably all written in the 50s or 60s, maybe 70 at the latest, but probably 50s or 60s. But even if we go with the late date, even if we agree with the skeptic and say, fine, 70 to 90, that's still within the 1st century. That's still very early attestation. Secondly, they are the earliest gospels we possess. Although it's often claimed there were other competing gospels, there is simply no evidence for that. There are no such documents, not even any fragments of them. That's a claim that's based on assumption alone. The earliest historical documents we possess that we can study are none other than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, there were other early gospels that were written, and you can see number 3, there were other gospels written, such as the Gospels of Thomas, Mary, Judas, the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Philip. You'll probably hear people bring those up before. I remember whenever they find one of these new Gospels, it's supposed to totally shatter the way we see Christianity. And, we're rethinking everything we know about the biblical Gospels. The problem is every single one of these Gospels is dated to the 2nd and 3rd century and later. All of these come at least an entire century after the biblical Gospels. So are there other Gospels? Yes, but they all come later. They're all written after the fact. And what adds to it is most of these Gospels are written from a Gnostic perspective. Gnosticism was an early type of heresy. Gnosticism didn't even appear on the scene until Christianity had already been established and been flourishing for decades. So are there other Gospels? Yes, that were all written after the 4 biblical Gospels. Make sense? The earliest Gospels we have on record are the 4 biblical Gospels. And number 4, they were attested as the only authoritative sources about Jesus very early in church history. By the early 2nd century, we find the church fathers quoting from all 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We don't find them quoting from any other supposed Gospels. What we do find, though, is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In fact, we find them quoting Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John even before those other Gospels were even written. By 155 AD, Justin Martyr wrote about the memoirs of Jesus, which he says are called Gospels. And we know which books Justin considered Gospels. He didn't provide a list, but when you read the rest of Justin's writings, he quotes from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, never any others. Between 170 to 180, Irenaeus of Lyons wrote this: "The Gospels are 4 in number, neither more nor less." Now, Irenaeus had been discipled by Polycarp, and Polycarp had actually been a disciple of the Apostle John. And so this shows that from a very early time frame, the church leaders only quoted from and acknowledged Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the 4 biblical Gospels. In fact, they were quoting these, using them, and endorsing them even before these other Gospels were even making the rounds. The other factor to consider is early dates and preservation. Again, as we talked about last week, the New Testament, and the Gospels in our case, are arguably the best preserved texts in all ancient literature. Remember, we don't have the original autographs. Sometimes people will think they can stump you with that. You know, we don't have the original autographs of the New Testament, and that's where you can turn around and say, we don't have the original autographs of any ancient writings at all. All we have for any of them is a copy of a copy. So if you want to chuck out the Gospels, you're going to have to chuck out every bit of ancient writing that we have. However, our earliest copies of the Gospels go back to a mere decades within the original writings, and in most cases, no more than 200 years. The biggest time gap we have between the original writings and the earliest manuscripts is no more than 200 years. Now, if that sounds like a lot, compare it with other ancient writings, such as Plato and Julius Caesar. There's a 1,000 years or more between when their works were written and when we have our earliest manuscripts available. So the New Testament documents are way more reliable as far as early manuscript dates go. Also, we have 5,800 Greek manuscripts to compare and contrast with each other. We talked last week about how the more manuscripts you have in the original language, the more you can compare and contrast them to make sure no wordings have been changed. If you've got 5,800 Greek manuscripts and 5,750 of them all say one thing, you have very good confidence that that's actually what it said. That stands in stark contrast with other ancient writings where you've got a few dozen, maybe a few hundred documents in the original language. Maybe a few hundred. Normally, it's just a couple dozen. But the New Testament, you've got over 5,800. And between all those manuscripts, there is a 99% accuracy rate among these manuscripts. The 1% of difference is, again, mostly grammar and spelling. So we put all this together, and we can affirm, even with a biblical skeptic like Bart Ehrman, that the New Testament is the best attested book from the ancient world. Now, one other factor in this first point that we'll consider is the bias test. Because one of the things you'll often hear from skeptics is that you can't trust the gospel authors about Jesus because they were biased. But I think there's a very good argument that can actually show that they were not biased. And what is that? It's that when you read the Gospels, they will often include really embarrassing information about themselves. Normally, when you have someone kind of trying to pull a con, and they are making up myths or stories to try to gain followers and gain power for themselves, they normally boost themselves and make themselves look really good because they want people to follow them. If you're Peter and you're trying to dupe everybody and make them think, hey, I'm Jesus's guy, you should listen to me, what are your fictional stories going to include? Oh, Peter, you're so enlightened, you're so wonderful, you're so perfect. Peter always has the right answer. Peter always knows the right thing to do. But how do we see Peter portrayed even in Mark's gospel, which Peter himself delivered? Peter is an absolute buffoon. And the one time he does get it right, and he makes his confession, you are the Christ, 2 seconds later, Jesus turns around and calls him Satan. Peter is always the one putting his foot in his mouth. Peter is always the one being rash. He's being cowardly. Excuse me. He's always confused. He's always slow to understand. He's always the one getting called out. This does not look like the testimony of somebody who's making up stories to try to gain followers for himself. So that adds a bit of credibility to it. Excuse me. All right. So our next section is going to be Jesus in non-biblical authors. Now, it is 8:02. Let's put it to a vote. Who wants to have a break now? Who wants to wait until we get through section number 2? All in favor of waiting to the end of section 2, raise your hand. All right, that's the majority. All right, let's do section number 2 then. Jesus and non-biblical authors. Now, I think we've established a pretty good case for believing the Gospels, that they are credible sources of information. But we can also turn to non-biblical historical sources, and we can actually learn a lot of the same information about Jesus from non-biblical authors. And that's what we're going to do. We'll look at a couple examples. The first is from a Jewish historian by the name Josephus. Josephus wrote end of the 1st century, around 93, 94 AD. Now, I actually include 2 different texts from Josephus because the first text includes some lines that I don't think Josephus actually wrote. He speaks so highly of Jesus, but in other parts, we know Josephus was not a Christian. And he talks about Jesus being more than a man, says Jesus was the Christ, that he for sure rose again. I think it's likely Josephus probably didn't write that. However, Josephus did write about Jesus. And I think we have a more kind of accurate recovery of what Josephus did write. And it's still a really good testimony. Look at the second quote there. Here's what I think Josephus probably more likely wrote. At this time, there was a wise man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. And those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. So here is a non-Christian, secular Jewish historian writing about Jesus. And what does he say about him? He says he was a good and virtuous man. He had lots of people following him, that there was a real Roman governor named Pontius Pilate who ordered him to be crucified, that after he had died, his disciples reported seeing him alive again 3 days later, that there was a lot of speculation he was perhaps the Messiah. So that's a really interesting report from a non-Christian source, a very early non-Christian source. We find out something else about Jesus from the same writings of Josephus, where he talks about Jesus' brother James. He affirms that this Jesus had a brother named James. We've got another source of information we can turn to, a guy named Tacitus. Tacitus was a Roman historian and politician. He wrote around 116 AD, so less than 100 years after Jesus. Tacitus was writing about how the Emperor Nero in the 60s was suspected of burning Rome. Rome burned to the ground in the 60s. And it was suspected that the Emperor Nero, who was just an absolutely debauched maniac, it was rumored that Nero started the fire himself because he wanted to rebuild Rome in his own image. And when Nero heard these accusations, he needed a scapegoat to peg the blame on. So he picked this minority group, the Christians. And Tacitus admits this. And then he talks about the Christians, and he says, called Christians by the populace, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So here Tacitus admits there was this guy named Christus, or Christ, from whom the Christians got their name, who suffered the extreme penalty, which for the Romans meant crucifixion. That was the ultimate execution method, under Emperor Tiberius, which is exactly who the emperor was during the life of Jesus. And again, he affirms it was done under the charge of Pontius Pilate. So now we have a second historical testimony of Jesus being crucified under Pontius Pilate. Pliny the Younger, he was a Roman statesman. He wrote a couple of years before Tacitus. And he was actually charged by the Roman Emperor Trajan to do an investigation into the Christians. Trajan heard about these Christians, knew they had a bad name, but he didn't actually know very much about them. So he asked Pliny to do a bit of an investigation and find out, what do they do? How does this whole Christian thing work? And so Pliny did an investigation and wrote a letter back with his findings. And here's what he says. On a stated day, they met together before it was light and to sing a hymn to Christ as to a god. And he talks about some other things they do there that made up their church services. But first of all, I want to point out, he says they met together before it was light. We have it really good meeting at 11 o'clock in the morning at Darby Community Church because they were up, they had a sunrise service every day. But what did they do? They sang a hymn to Christ as to a God. This shows that very early on, Jesus was the center of the church's liturgy, and they were worshiping him as divine. Jesus, again, was not just considered this moral teacher. Even the early Romans recognized Jesus is worshipped as a god. We have a writing there by Lucian of Samosata. He was a Greek author. He was a comedy writer. And he writes in one of his works, "The Christians, you know, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account." So he says the Christians worship a man who introduced their faith and who was crucified for it. And then he sort of shows this sort of mocking pity. Oh, these misguided creatures. They start with this general conviction that they're immortal for all time. That explains why they have this contempt for death and voluntary self-devotion. That explains why they're willing to die and why they're willing to lay down their lives. They actually buy into the teachings of this guy, Jesus, who was crucified, that they're going to live forever. He says they call themselves brothers. It says it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers. This crucified teacher of theirs taught them that you're all part of one big family. And then it says they worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. So here we have middle of the 2nd century, again, a testimony. Christians are worshiping Jesus. Jesus was crucified, and they devote their life to following his teachers. Celsus was a Greek philosopher who wrote towards the end of the 2nd century. Now, his original writings have been lost, but what we do have is quotes from Celsus and references to Celsus in other early writings. So we can piece together some of what he said by how other early writers refer to him. And this is through the writing of Origen, and he's quoting Celsus. And according to Celsus, this Greek philosopher, Jesus invented his birth from a virgin. According to Celsus, Jesus was born of a poor woman who, to cover up the scandal of her infidelity, made up this whole story about the virgin birth. Then he says this Jesus went to Egypt and he learned miraculous powers. And that's how he was able to do the things that he did. And then he came back and he proclaimed himself a god. Well, Celsus, of course, is not a Christian, but he affirms 3 really important things. One, he affirms an early teaching of the virgin birth, that from the start it was claimed Jesus was born of a virgin. Secondly, that Jesus did miracles. Celsus is a Greek philosopher. He's all about logic and reason, and he doesn't try to naturalistically explain away the miracles. He really believes that Jesus did miracles. He just thinks he was a magician who learned dark arts in Egypt. And then he affirms Jesus really did proclaim himself to be a god. And the next quote I included there, we won't read it, but that's basically Celsus wrestling with this idea of how can God become a man? He recognized that was the central claim of Christianity, that God became a man. And he doesn't think that that's philosophically possible. But again, he affirms 3 important things about Jesus. And then we have the Talmud. The Talmud was a collection of Jewish writings from between the 3rd to 6th centuries AD. And there's one section called the Talmud Sanhedrin, section 43a, and listen to what it says. On the eve of Passover, they hung Yeshu, and the crier went forth for 40 days beforehand, declaring that Yeshu is going to be stoned for practicing witchcraft. Now, Yeshu is the Jewish name Yeshua. It's from Joshua. It's also what we would translate as Jesus. If you were to hear, if you've ever seen The Passion of the Christ, where they actually have the actors speaking in the original Aramaic language that Jesus would have spoken, the characters don't call him Jesus like a good Southern preacher. They refer to him as Yeshua. That was his Hebrew name. So here we have this report that over Passover, these Jews hung Yeshua, who was stoned for practicing witchcraft. And it says he was on trial, but it says no one had anything to exonerate him. And they hung him on the eve of Passover. And it says he was different because he was close to the government. Now, a couple interesting things here. First of all, again, Yeshua is the name of Jesus. Well, Jesus, Joshua, that was kind of a common name. How do we know it's the same one? Well, it happened over the Passover holiday, which matches what we know about the Gospels. He was accused of practicing witchcraft which was the miracles and the signs that Jesus was doing. But then it's interesting, it tells us right there, if you perform witchcraft, the penalty was you got stoned to death. But this Yeshua didn't get stoned to death. What did they do with him? They hung him, which would imply that they didn't actually do. The Jews wouldn't hang people. That's what happened when the Romans crucified them. So this is saying that this Yeshua, who was doing magic and witchcraft, we had this trial, no one came to his defense, so he was hung. That aligns almost exactly with what the Gospels tell us about the trial of Jesus at the hands of the Jews. And what's interesting there is, just like with Celsus, the Talmud does not deny that Jesus did miracles. They simply ascribe it to witchcraft. Now, putting all these pieces together from these early non-Christian sources, we get a picture of Jesus that actually aligns very accurately with the Gospels. First of all, that he existed. I think there's a very small minority of people who will still try to claim Jesus never actually existed. Jesus existed. He was said to be born from a virgin. Oh, and the last thing I forgot in the Talmud there, when it says he was close to the government, that means he comes from a family line that is connected to the government. In this case, that's the line of David, because that's the kingly line. So, from all these sources combined, Jesus existed. He was said to be born from a virgin. He was from King David's line. He had a brother named James. He was a teacher who attracted large crowds. He was known for his upright conduct. He performed miracles. He provided commands for his followers to obey. He called his followers a family of brothers. He claimed to be God in the flesh. He was regarded by many as the Messiah. He was regarded by the Jews as a blasphemer. He was put on trial by the Jews. He was convicted and crucified under the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. He died during the days of the Roman Emperor Tiberius. He was said to be seen alive by his followers 3 days later. He started Christianity, and he was worshipped as God by Christians on a particular day each week. You know what's amazing about this is when I've just read all this, I have not quoted any Bible verses here. This is just collecting from what early authors affirmed about Jesus, which actually aligns with what the Gospels tell us about Jesus. One other thing we could consider before we end the second section and take our break, and that is that there were two writings by two early Greek writers, a guy named Thallus and a guy named Phlegon. Phlegon sounds like something you would snort up. So I have a hard time saying it without laughing. Both of these guys, though, again, their original writings were lost, but they are quoted in other ancient writings. And both of them attest to a very strange darkness that covered the land in the same year that Jesus died. And they try to explain it away as an eclipse. The problem was that was not the right time of the year for an eclipse. And that's one of the things they've been criticized for, is it couldn't have been an eclipse because that wasn't happening that time of year. But both of these non-Christian sources talked about a strange darkness that covered the land. And they even said it was during the time of Tiberius Caesar. It was around 33 AD. It was a greater darkness than had been known. And it says starting at the 6th hour of the day. Now that's important because the 6th hour of the day, that was 12 o'clock noon. They would start recording the time from when the sun came up, which was about 6 a.m. So the 6th hour was 12 o'clock noon. According to the Gospels, the 6th hour is exactly when darkness covered the land at Jesus' crucifixion. So these are somewhat more disputed, but I think you have a pretty good argument from here that even just describing this mysterious darkness is even itself testified by other pagan writings. Okay, any questions about what we've covered so far before we move on to our break? No? All right, well, let's go ahead and we'll take about 5-10 minutes and then we'll reconvene. All right, well, welcome back to part 2 of our lecture on the case for Christ. And yes, the setting is a little bit different than where we last left off. So what happened was the second part of the original lecture, for some reason, didn't get recorded. And rather than just stick with the first half, I think I said at the beginning, this lecture is so important that I want to make sure you guys get the full access to all of the content. I know a lot of people have been tuning in and watching these videos afterwards, so I want to make sure you guys are still able to get this hearty stuff on the case for Jesus. So in the first half, we talked about the reliability of the Gospels that tell us about Jesus, and then we also talked about ancient non-Christian sources of information about Jesus. And we're going to be picking it up now, if you're using lecture notes, on section 3, fulfilled prophecy. We're going to talk about prophecies about Jesus and then prophecies made by Jesus. Now, in our anti-supernaturalist age, when we hear the word prophecy, it might sound a little hokey to us. And so a lot of Christians might feel awkward using it in apologetics, but it can actually be very powerful if you can demonstrate that a prophecy, a documented case where a prophecy was made at an earlier point in history, and then you've got good documentation that that specific prophecy did in fact come true, then that becomes a powerful apologetic. What if a large collection of writings accurately predicted definitive details about what God said he would do or about what a certain man would do, and then it happened? That should at least grab our attention and should be one of those clues that, if God were real, it makes sense that he would be able to do this. So maybe if I see it happening, and I don't mean like one little cryptic prophecy. I mean like large quantities of very specific prophecies. If those were to come true, that should at least grab our attention. Now, the Old Testament contains, scholars estimate, somewhere between 200 to 300 prophecies about this Messiah figure. Messiah was a word that meant anointed one. And so the Old Testament scriptures, written over many, many centuries by a variety of authors, had hundreds of prophecies about this anointed one who would enter history and fulfill God's plan to redeem creation. There's many types of prophecies. Some of them are direct, where they say ahead of time, he will do such and such. And then there's prophecies that more refer to types of certain people or institutions. So things like the function of the temple or the Passover lamb. And the New Testament scriptures record Jesus fulfilled these types. For the sake of time, we're going to focus on the specific foretellings about specific things this anointed one would do. And, in any of these lectures, for the sake of time, there's always certain sections that get minimized or shortened or abridged. And for this lecture, the prophecy one is going to be the abridged one, probably because I think we've heard it so many times before, usually at Christmas time. So I think this is the section that, if anything, you'll be most familiar with. So we're still going to dig into it a little bit, but it's going to be a shortened version of it. So we're going to do a real quick flyby of some of the very specific prophecies made about this Messiah. So, for example, if you have a copy of the lecture notes, I include next to each section both in the Old Testament scriptures where this prophecy was made, and then in the New Testament scriptures where it shows Jesus fulfilling this prophecy. So, for example, this Messiah would be born from Abraham's family, and of the 12 sons of Jacob, he would come specifically from the line of Judah. That was the kingly tribe. He would descend from the line of Jesse and King David. So it had to be from David's line, and his kingdom would last forever. He would be born of a virgin and would be called Emmanuel, meaning God with us. He would be God and yet would be born as a human baby. He would be born in the little town of Bethlehem. He would have humble origins. He wouldn't come from an aristocratic family that had notable presence or power in the culture. He would come from very humble origins. He would be born during the days of the Roman Empire. He would be preceded by an Elijah-like forerunner who would announce that he was coming. He would have the Holy Spirit come upon him in a unique way. His ministry would start in Galilee. His ministry would consist of healing the blind and the sick. He would teach in parables. That would be his teaching mechanism. And those parables would fall upon hard hearts, many people who would not listen to him. He would be revealed to the city of Jerusalem, riding on a donkey. This revealing of him in Jerusalem and his execution to follow would happen 483 years after the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. He would be betrayed by a friend. He would be opposed by both Jewish and Gentile rulers. He would not open up his mouth to make a defense for himself when these false accusations were lobbied. He would be beaten to a pulp beyond recognition. He would be pierced and would be publicly executed for all to see. He would have his hands and feet pierced. His clothes would be gambled for. He would be publicly made fun of during his execution. He would experience divine abandonment. He would have the guilt of sinners laid upon him. He would receive divine punishment instead of sinners. He would be executed along with other criminals, but would be buried in a rich man's grave.
He would rise from the dead on the third day. He would ascend to the throne of God and receive all authority. His kingdom would include both Jews and Gentiles, and that kingdom would gradually, slowly fill the entire world. Everything I just said can be found in the Old Testament scriptures about this coming Messiah. And then the New Testament shows how Jesus fulfilled these things. Now, some people have said, well, it would have been easy for one man to intentionally try to fulfill these prophecies to make it look like he was the Messiah. And that could have been the case, but then there are certain prophecies that if Jesus were just a man, he couldn't have controlled, such as the city where he was born in Bethlehem, the fact that he was born under the Roman Empire, the fact that he was revealed in Jerusalem 483 years after the decree to rebuild Jerusalem, the fact that he was executed by means of being pierced and lifted up, the fact that he was buried in a rich man's grave. Those were all things that any normal man couldn't have controlled, and yet we see Jesus fulfilling all these things. So those are some of the prophecies about Jesus. But then one thing we often underestimate is that Jesus himself actually made prophecies, and there's a really big one he made. We can find this in both we can find it in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. This is known as the Olivet Discourse, and this is given by Jesus. It's a very lengthy passage of scripture, and it is given on the Tuesday before Christ's death as he's standing with his disciples overlooking the city of Jerusalem, and the disciples are marveling at the temple in the distance, and they say, wow, look at these beautiful stones. And Jesus goes on to give this very specific prophecy that says several things. First, he said that every stone of that temple would be thrown down. He said that Gentile armies would surround the city of Jerusalem, lay siege to it, utterly destroy the city of Jerusalem, and then all of this was to happen within a generation. And in Hebrew terminology, a generation meant 40 years. So again, you can read about this in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. Many of these passages are often mistaken to be about the end times, and we could have a whole other discussion about that. I think these are actually Jesus predicting a real historical event within 40 years, because he said these things will happen within a generation, and a generation was 40 years. And sure enough, in 70 AD, which is within 40 years of these words of Christ, that is exactly what happened. There was a Roman general by the name of Titus, and he laid siege to Jerusalem for 5 months. He brought his Roman armies, and just like Jesus said, they surrounded the city. I actually have an adorable little nephew named Titus. And when I found out that my relatives were naming him Titus, my first thought was, oh yes, the Roman general who laid siege to Jerusalem. But I think they were probably thinking of the pastor Titus, who the New Testament book is named after. But this Roman general Titus laid siege to Jerusalem for 5 months, and then eventually broke into the city, slaughtered all the Jews, decimated the city, literally tore down every block of the temple, which has never been rebuilt to this day. And this event was actually chronicled by first century Jewish historian Josephus, who I've mentioned a lot. He's kind of our buddy in this lecture. Josephus was there in the city and documented everything that was happening. And when you read the account of Josephus about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, it sounds a lot like the Olivet Discourse. And so I think we see a very strong fulfillment of Christ's words. Now, for that very reason, some skeptics have, like the book of Daniel, claimed that these words had to have been written after the fact. Jesus didn't really say these. Christians made this up after 70 AD and tried to pass it off as Jesus beforehand. But last week in our lecture, we talked about how I think there's very, very good reason to believe that the Gospels, at least Luke and Mark, were written in the 60s or late 50s. And so Jesus did indeed make this prediction 40 years before it happened. Okay, so between these two things, we've seen there's very specific prophecies about Jesus that this one man fulfilled, and then Jesus himself made prophecies that came fulfilled. Now we're going to turn to point number 4, and if you're using lecture notes, this is on page 12, and we're going to talk about the case for the resurrection. Part of the reason why, even though the original recording got deleted, one of the reasons why I wanted to still go ahead and re-record this is because the case for the resurrection is absolutely critical. It is at the heartbeat of the Christian faith. You cannot have an apologetic series without something on the resurrection. Easter here is just around the corner. And that is a worldwide holiday where Christians all across the globe celebrate the resurrection of Jesus, as is fitting. Easter, the resurrection, is at the heartbeat of the Christian faith. You take away the resurrection, you don't have Christianity. We see this in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I'm going to read to you verses 14 through 19. Paul says, "If Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain. We are even found to be misrepresenting God, because we testified about God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, and you're still in your sins. Then those also who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. If in Christ we have hope in this life only, we are of all people most to be pitied." What is Paul saying there? He's saying that if Jesus wasn't really raised, everything we're preaching means absolutely nothing. The faith that millions of Christians have means absolutely nothing. He says, if Christ has not been raised, your faith means diddly squat. You're still dead in your sins. In fact, he says, if Jesus hasn't been raised, then all those people who have believed in Jesus and died, then they are the most pitiable people in the face of the earth. Christians who have wrapped up their whole hope in Jesus, Christians should be pitied more than anybody because we've based everything on a lie. Now, this reveals one of the unique tenets of Christianity. Christianity is centered in a historical event that either did or did not happen. If Jesus is raised, Christianity is true. If Jesus was not raised, Christianity is false. So the entirety of the religion is tethered to a historical event that either did or did not happen. And far from hiding from critique, the Apostle Paul here actually invites critics of Christianity to investigate its claims. At first, this might be intimidating to Christians because what if you investigate and Jesus didn't really rise? Then our faith is for nothing. But we can actually, from an apologetic perspective, be glad about that and say, unlike other religions, ours can be tested to be demonstrated for truth. The Buddhist claim, the Hindu claim, it can't be tested. It can't be investigated. You can't do research into whether or not the claims of Buddhism are true. They're metaphysical claims with no way for validation. But the central Christian claim is about a historical event, so it can be investigated. And if it can be proven true, then that means our Christian faith is grounded in truth. Paul here says if Jesus didn't really rise, our faith is pointless. But Paul does not then call for blind faith or wishful thinking. He does not say, shut your ears to the evidence and hope that it's true. Rather, he is confident the resurrection can withstand scrutiny. He invites people to investigate it and see that it is in fact real. Paul wraps up our eternal destiny with the historical fact of whether or not Jesus really rose, and he is confident it can withstand the scrutiny. Now, how can we know that Jesus really rose from the dead? There were no pictures or videos being taken at the time to document it, so there's other methods we have to rely on. And what we're going to do now is we're going to look at 5 historical realities that we can affirm with great confidence. If all 5 of these things can be affirmed, then there's good reason to believe the resurrection is the most plausible explanation. So 5 things. First, Jesus really died. Secondly, Jesus was really buried. Third, the tomb was really empty. Fourth, the eyewitnesses really claimed to see Jesus alive. And fifth, the eyewitnesses were really willing to die for their claims. So let's investigate these one at a time. First, Jesus really died. Now, an obvious way around the truth of the resurrection is to say that Jesus never died in the first place. This is what's known as the swoon theory. The swoon theory says Jesus didn't actually perish on the cross. He just passed out, and then his unconscious body was laid in the tomb. When he wakes up, he simply gets up and leaves the tomb 3 days later. So the idea goes, he never rose again because he never died in the first place. It just looked like he rose, it just looked like he died, which later made for a perceived but not real resurrection. Back in 2010, maybe, there was a Sherlock Holmes movie with Robert Downey Jr. and Jude Law, and the villain of this story was this rascal who was caught by Sherlock Holmes, and for his crimes, he was committed to hanging as a punishment. So he was hung, he was executed, he was laid in this tomb in the rock, and then a couple days later, he appeared out of the grave and was alive. And this convinced all his followers that he really is this special magician. He really is something special. But Sherlock Holmes investigated it and found out that, what actually happened was the villain hadn't really died. He had staged it so it looked like he was actually hung to death, but he never died in the first place. Therefore, there was no resurrection. He just tricked people into thinking he had been raised. And I apologize for the spoiler alert if you've never seen that movie. That's basically what the swoon theory is, that's what Jesus did. Now, there's many problems with the swoon theory. Let's just talk about three. First of all, even ancient non-Christian historians like Josephus and Tacitus affirm that Jesus was executed under Pontius Pilate. We saw that earlier under section 2. Secondly, the Romans were trained executioners. Death was their specialty. From the time they were young, they were trained in how to kill people. That's how they conquered the world, was because they specialized in killing people. In fact, one of the things that the Roman guards would do is they would check prisoners to make sure they had really died. And if someone did not perish on the cross after a certain amount of time, the Romans would make sure they were dead. No one accidentally came down from the cross alive. In fact, there are no historical records of anybody accidentally surviving an execution. There is one record of a guy who was taken down from a cross, but that's because some ruler had pity on him at the last moment and ordered him to be taken down before he could die. But it was intentional. There's no instances of someone accidentally being brought down, like the Romans wrongly assumed he was dead. The Romans knew how to do their job. They knew how to kill people. Thirdly, even if, let's say, somehow, some way, Jesus did survive crucifixion and they lay his unconscious body in a tomb, he had been brutally beaten so badly through being punched, through being flogged with the cat of nine tails, through having to carry this cross and being hung up there for so long. He had lost so much blood and had been beaten so badly, as was typical, that if he didn't die on the cross, he certainly would have died in the tomb. Sealed there inside the rock, he certainly would have given into his injuries. There's no way that this half-dead man is able to get up, roll away the stone, and walk around like nothing had happened. So for these reasons and more, the swoon theory has mostly been abandoned, even in secular scholarship. Even leading skeptics like Bart Ehrman has affirmed, this is a quote from Ehrman, "The crucifixion of Jesus by the Romans is one of the most secure facts we have about his life." So point number one is proven. Jesus really died. That brings us to fact number 2. Jesus was really buried. Now, some skeptics, like the man I just mentioned, Bart Ehrman, who I bring up a lot because he's one of the leading skeptics of today's day and age. Bart Ehrman and others like him claim that Jesus wasn't actually buried. And the reason for that is because the typical treatment that a crucified victim would receive is his body would just be left up on the cross for days and days and days. Very often, what would happen is if someone was crucified, the Romans wouldn't even bother with the body. They would leave it up there. And in fact, that was part of the humiliating process of being crucified, is that you weren't given a decent burial. Your friends and family would have to go by day after day and watch you slowly decompose and get eaten and torn apart by birds and beasts alike. So the claims of Ehrman and others is, well, why would Jesus be buried? Why wouldn't the Romans have just left him up there, like any normal criminal? In that case, the disciples saying, look, an empty tomb, wouldn't be that remarkable because there had never been a body in the tomb in the first place. But there's several reasons to affirm that Jesus was really buried. The first one is found in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 22 and 23. That in the Mosaic law required Jews to take down the body of a hanged criminal and bury him on the same day on which he died. Now, again, this is a criminal. So this is even for those whom the Jews recognized as lawbreakers and worthy of death. Even Jewish criminals, if their body was hung up, they were required to be taken down and buried on that same day. This was a priority for the Jews. It was a part of their law. And this priority was confirmed by, again, our buddy Josephus in his volume, The Jewish Wars from 75 AD. He documented how there was this group of Jewish insurgents who tried to rebel with the sword against Rome. They were all crucified for their crimes against Rome, but they were taken down and buried by their fellow Jews on the same day. This practice, secondly, this practice of taking down the bodies and burying them was confirmed in 1968. There was the discovery of a tomb of a Jewish man named Jehohanan, and he had also been crucified in the first century like Jesus, and they found his remains buried in a tomb. So whatever he did, the Romans must not have been very happy because they crucified him for it, but the Jews still took down his body and buried it. It reveals that they were sticking to the priority of Deuteronomy 21. There's number 3, there's a volume called the Digest. The Digest is a compilation of ancient Roman laws going all the way up until about the 6th century, but it's a collection of all these ancient Roman laws that made up those first couple centuries. And there was an allowance in there that said, yeah, sure, in general, the Romans would leave up criminals to rot or be pecked away by the birds, but there was an allowance. If someone came and asked for the body, it could be taken down. The Romans didn't require that the bodies be left up there. If someone came and asked for it, it could be given to them. And that is exactly what all 4 Gospels record about Jesus. There was a man named Joseph of Arimathea who requested the body from Pontius Pilate, and Pilate permitted him. This lines up perfectly with other historical evidence of how Jewish bodies were treated and how Rome allowed their bodies to be handled. Now, if Joseph did not really take Jesus's body, the Jewish leaders could have easily pointed this out. If the disciples start going around saying, oh, Jesus is risen from the dead, then the Jews could have said, well, look, there's his decomposing body on the cross. But fourthly, I mentioned Joseph of Arimathea. He's actually another line of proof. He provides another strong reason to believe Jesus was really buried, because the Gospels say that Joseph buried Jesus in his family's own public tomb. Now, that's important because Joseph was a well-known and well-respected member of the same Sanhedrin that had condemned Jesus to death. So everybody would have known who Joseph was. Everybody would have known the location of this family tomb. It would have been publicly known. It would have been accessible. So if Joseph did not really bury Jesus, like all the early Christian stories said he did, if Joseph never buried Jesus, all the Jewish leaders would have had to have done was bring out Joseph and say, hey, Joseph, did you really bury the body of Jesus or not? And Joseph, being a member of the Sanhedrin, could have easily said, no, of course I wouldn't. Why would I do such a thing? And immediately the disciples' whole story collapses in on itself. The religious leaders could have debunked the resurrection claims very easily by simply bringing out this well-known Joseph of Arimathea, one of their own group, and saying, hey, Joe, did you bury Jesus or not? But they couldn't, because he really did, and that was well known. Fifthly, the Jewish leaders were aware of and acknowledged Christ's public burial. In Acts 13:29, Paul and Barnabas pointed out that the Jewish leaders, took him down from a tree, laid him in a tomb. This is undoubtedly a reference to Joseph of Arimathea, a member of that Sanhedrin, but it also shows that these religious leaders knew where Jesus was buried. And Matthew 27 confirms the same thing. The Jewish leaders knew where Jesus's body was. However, if they had nothing to do with his burial and they had no idea what had happened to the body, they could have immediately shut down those claims, saying, no, of course we don't know where Jesus is buried. You probably stole his body. But they couldn't say that because they knew Jesus was really buried. Sixthly, from the very beginning, Christ's followers did not merely claim he had died, but that he had been buried. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 and 4 says, for I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried. That line's important because even skeptical scholars will admit Paul wrote 1 Corinthians in the early to mid 50s AD. That's barely 20 years after the original events. And it's important. Paul says, I delivered to you what I also received. That is this creedal statement. Jesus died and was buried. Didn't start with Paul. Paul was passing it on, but he had himself received it from other Christians. Well, when was Paul converted? That was in 36 AD, just a couple of years after the events of Jesus. So as early as 36 AD, Christians are saying Jesus was buried. So that's a very, very early claim. You also have to think about the fact that if the resurrection claims focused on an empty tomb, the Jewish leaders could have easily drawn attention to the fact that there was no tomb in the first place. If the women and the disciples start going around saying there's an empty tomb, all the religious leaders have to do is say, guys, everybody knows there's no tomb in the first place. But they couldn't, because Jesus was really buried. All right. Next, thirdly, the tomb was really empty. So Jesus's body was buried in a public place that belonged to a well-known and esteemed man of the Jewish council. 3 days later, the disciples were claiming that his body was no longer in the tomb. And if that were false, the Jewish leaders could have easily and immediately exposed this by simply bringing out the corpse. If the tomb still had a body in it, then this movement would have never got off the ground, because the religious leaders who knew where this public tomb was could have brought out the corpse of Jesus and would have shut this down from the get-go. Their inability to do so, the religious leaders' inability to bring forth a body, is a bit of an awkward concession that there was no body to bring out. In fact, the early Jewish opponents of Christianity conceded the fact that there was no body by making the claim that the disciples had stolen it. In Matthew's gospel, Matthew 28, which I believe was written about 30 to 40 years after the fact, so maybe the 60s, maybe 70 AD, he reveals that even to that day when he was writing it, the Jewish claim was that the disciples had stolen the body of Jesus. Now, what that means is no one tried to deny that Jesus's body was really missing. The empty tomb was a fact that even the Jewish opponents acknowledged. They just tried to come up with an alternate narrative for it. They said that the reason the tomb was empty is because the disciples stole the body. But that's nothing less than an admission that the body was really gone. The tomb was really empty. Now, skeptics today will offer a similar claim that, yeah, the tomb was empty, but that's because, again, you can't deny Jesus died. You can't deny that Jesus was buried. But the reason why the tomb was empty is because the disciples stole it. But this claim has several problems. First of all, Matthew's Gospel, chapter 27, tells us that there were guards or soldiers standing watch over the tomb. So the disciples couldn't have just hijacked a place and broken in. Now, some have suggested that Matthew made up this detail because Luke and Mark don't include it. Now, I don't believe that's true. However, let's just say for the sake of argument that Matthew did make it up. Maybe there weren't actually soldiers in front of the tomb. Again, just for the sake of argument. The claim would then be, if there's no guards, the disciples could have easily slipped in and taken the body. There's still several problems with that idea. First of all, there are names and collaborating testimonies about the empty tomb, but there are no names, no collaborative testimonies, and no evidence presented to support the claim the disciples stole the body. There's no proposed alternate locations. There's no proposed names about who was involved or how it happened. We have documented information from multiple sources about the tomb being empty and Jesus rising, but absolutely none about the body being stolen. So that is raw speculation with not a shred of evidence to back it up. And we need to consider this, that claim that the body was stolen was put forward by those who had a very heavily vested interest in keeping Jesus dead. That claim was made by the religious leaders who had a lot to lose, a lot of power to lose if Jesus was really alive. And this is where I want to bring up that topic of motive again. The skeptic will often be suspicious of the disciples' motive because they will say the disciples had an incentive for claiming Jesus was really risen. But if you're going to pull the motive card, I think you need to be even more so suspicious of the Jewish leaders' motive for claiming his body had been stolen. After all, what is the disciples' motive for claiming that Jesus is alive? What do you get out of that if you make up that lie? You get rejection, you get suffering, and you get eventually martyrdom, which they did. What did so the disciples have nothing to gain by saying the body's not there and Jesus has really risen. They have nothing to gain by that. But the religious leaders have much to lose. If Jesus's body is really gone, then that means that if you remember, the Jewish leaders were always threatened by Jesus's teachings. They always felt challenged by him. Even Pilate noticed that they were envious of him. So they did not want the ideas of Jesus still circulating. They didn't want to face this idea that Jesus was still alive and that his followers could still rally around him. Their power, their authority, their reputation, it was all on the line. So if we're examining these two groups, the disciples on one hand and the religious leaders on the other. Who had more to lose by making up a lie in this situation? If we're going to talk about motive, who had the stronger motive, who had a stronger selfish motive for making up a lie? It would be the religious leaders, because they had way more from a human perspective to lose. So if you're going to be suspicious about motive, I think the suspicion needs to lie with the religious leaders, not with the disciples. And then lastly, as we'll consider later, all the apostles were willing to suffer terrible deaths for their claim that Jesus had really risen. If they had stolen the body and made up the whole story, it is unlikely that every single one of them would willingly undergo scorn, torture, and death for such a claim. We'll flesh that out in a little bit. Now, another proof for the empty tomb is the fact that all four Gospels record that women were the first eyewitnesses of the empty tomb. At that time, according to even Jewish tradition and even legal proceedings, at that time, a woman's testimony was not considered legally valid in court. So if the gospel authors were trying to fabricate a story about an empty tomb and they wanted people to believe them, they would not have picked the people group that would have been immediately dismissed. If you're trying to get credibility for a lie, you don't pick the one group of people that everybody is immediately going to dismiss. If women start opening their mouths and saying, we're eyewitnesses, we saw the empty tomb, no one's going to take them seriously. So if the disciples made that info up, they were being absolute idiots, and the movement never would have taken off, because you don't pick the one group that nobody's going to listen to as your leading witnesses. The most probable explanation for all four Gospels testifying that women found the empty tomb is that there really was a bodiless grave found by the women. So Jesus's body was really missing from the tomb. Now we come to number 4. The eyewitnesses really claimed to see Jesus alive. Okay, very well. The body is missing. So what? Other theories have been proposed. Maybe thieves stole, maybe it wasn't the disciples, maybe the thieves stole the body, or maybe some will say the women went to the wrong tomb. But now there's another crucial piece of information we have to introduce. Jesus was said to be seen alive by many witnesses in the days that followed. That's important, because if the body just goes missing and no one has any way to account for it, and that's the end of the story, then sure, maybe it was stolen, maybe the women did go to the wrong tomb. But you now have many, many witnesses claiming to have actually had physical encounters with Jesus in the days that follow. And this is not simply a claim of the Bible. The claim that there were witnesses who really believed they saw Jesus alive, that's not just a claim of the Bible, that is an agreed upon fact even by the skeptic. Now, all four Gospels put forward at least a dozen eyewitnesses by name. So it doesn't just say people saw Jesus. The Gospels actually name who they were. And these witnesses would have been known to the original readers and could have been cross-examined. In Acts chapter 1, verses 21 and 22, one of the mandatory requirements of being an apostle is that it had to have been someone who was not just with Jesus during his earthly ministry, but someone who had personally encountered him after his resurrection. It could not simply be someone who believed Jesus rose. It had to have been someone who actually met and encountered him after the resurrection. Peter told a huge crowd of thousands in Acts chapter 2, verse 32, "This Jesus God raised up, and of that we are all witnesses," referring to himself and the other apostles. The central claim of the apostolic authors of the New Testament, Peter, John, Paul, and the others, the central claim was that they had personally seen, touched, talked with, ate with, and interacted with Jesus. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, I'm going back there again, verses 3 through 8 is a particularly powerful passage. It says this, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles." Here, Paul presents an overwhelming eyewitness testimony. First, he calls on Cephas, that is Peter. Then he calls on the 12. That's the other original apostles. He also mentions the testimony of James, the half-brother of Jesus. And then all the apostles. That's those beside the original 12. So already you've got a pretty extensive list of people that you could cross-examine. Remember, Paul wrote this in the early to mid-50s. These people are all still alive. But in the middle of that list, which is already a pretty impressive list, Paul then says, Jesus appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive. That last line is important. Most of whom are still alive. Because if, let's say, some author wrote this line decades and decades and decades later, end of the first century, even in the second century, and says, oh yeah, 500 people saw Jesus raised. Who's going to be able to confirm that? They've all been dust for years. But Paul, remember, wrote this. Even skeptics will acknowledge Paul wrote this in the early to mid 50s, which means Paul's words are true. Most of whom say they saw Jesus alive are still living to this day. Corinthians, if you don't believe me, go and interview these almost 500 people who are still alive who claim to have interacted with Jesus. If you doubt me, go and ask them for yourself. There's hundreds and hundreds to choose from. Again, this is all happening within about 20 years of the events. So most of those eyewitnesses are still living. And the fact that Paul wrote this in the early to mid 50s, as even skeptics will admit, actually has several important implications. First, that means this was actually written before the four Gospels. So before the Gospels were even written, you've got this early testimony about 500 witnesses. Secondly, again, it confirmed Paul's claims that most of those witnesses were still alive. If this had been written early second century, he could have been making it up. But the fact that he wrote it while they're still living means they could be cross-examined. But again, Paul's asking his readers to cross-examine him and confirm this evidence is true. And then remember, at the beginning of the passage, Paul says, "For I delivered to you what I also received." That means Paul is simply sharing information he himself had received from other Christians. And remember, like I said earlier, Paul was converted at about 36 AD. So within 3 years of the resurrection, there is known eyewitness testimony from the apostles and 500 other witnesses. That quantity of evidence of eyewitness testimony to within 3 years of the original event is absolutely overwhelming. Now, at this point, we haven't necessarily established that Jesus did rise. But what is beyond dispute is that after his death, a substantially large group of his followers claimed to have seen him risen. All right, so that's point number 4 we've established. That his followers, a large number of them, claimed to have seen him alive. Now we come to the 5th sort of layer in this overall evidential argument. And that is the eyewitnesses were really willing to die for their claims. So far, hopefully we've all agreed. Jesus really died. Jesus was really buried. The tomb was really empty. And many people really claim to have seen Jesus alive. But all right, you might be thinking, that doesn't mean he actually did. People make false claims all the time. How do we know the disciples weren't lying? All of the apostles, except for John, were executed for their faith. And that faith centered on the claim they had seen Jesus risen from the dead. But don't leave John out of the fun either, because even John had an attempted execution against his life. John was thrown in a vat of boiling oil. That was an attempt to kill him, and it didn't work. So he was exiled to the island of Patmos for the end of his life. So all of the apostles were willing to suffer torture and death for their claims, and all of them had at least an attempted martyrdom made against their life. Now, this is important, that every one of those apostles, witnesses to the resurrected Jesus, were all willing to suffer excruciating torture and death for that claim. That's important because liars make bad martyrs. Now, even one person will rarely be willing to die for something they know is false. In fact, I would contest most sane people wouldn't. Even one person would not be willing to die for something they know is false. How much less would dozens and dozens of people be willing to die for something they know is a lie? Now, many people are willing to die for what they think or hope is true. So you might think of like an Islamic terrorist who will kill themselves because they really believe they're getting a whole bunch of virgins in heaven. Well, they really believe that's true. They don't know that that's a lie. They're willing to give up their life because they think that it's true. What we're talking about here is if the apostles made up the story of the resurrection, then they would have known that it was false. So the skeptic has to make the claim that dozens of people were willing to die for something they absolutely knew was false and was made up. Now, many people will lie about something they know is false if it can benefit them. I mean, there's sleazy businessmen and politicians who all the time make false claims, but that's because they have something to profit from it. Maybe there's money on the line or power or influence, something like that. But people, especially large groups, don't lie about something they know is false if it only produces suffering for them and their group. But that's exactly what happened with the resurrection eyewitnesses. They were really willing to suffer and die for their claims. Chuck Colson was a political advisor who worked for President Richard Nixon. And he actually spent 7 months in prison in 1974 for his involvement in the Watergate scandal. Now, after the Watergate scandal first broke, there was an initial attempt to cover it up. But those efforts didn't last long because those who were in on the secret started turning on each other and testifying about each other and coming clean because they wanted to make deals to save their own skins. When they realized that the bloodhounds were close, they started making confessions and ratting each other out and talking about who lied about what in order to try to cut a deal and save their own skins. And after Watergate, when Chuck Colson was on trial, a friend actually gave him a copy of Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and Chuck Colson actually became a Christian. And until the end of his life, he ended up becoming an apologist with a very large ministry, all the way up until his death in 2012. Now, Colson actually used his experience with Watergate as proof for the resurrection. Listen to what he says. I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified they had seen Jesus raised from the dead. Then they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Every one of them was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured that if it weren't true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep a lie for 3 weeks. You're telling me 12 apostles could keep a lie for 40 years? Absolutely impossible. Another factor that must be noted is that some of those willing martyrs were former skeptics of Jesus. So James, his half-brother, had previously considered him out of his mind. Mark chapter 3 and John chapter 7 tell us that James and Jesus' other brothers thought he was crazy. And it says this explicitly, they didn't believe in him. And yet after experiencing Christ after his resurrection, James became not just a believer, but a significant leader in the early church and was stoned to death for his faith in the resurrection of Jesus in the 60s. Another even more powerful example is Paul. Paul had been a violent persecutor of the early church, and yet after encountering a resurrected Christ, Paul immediately began preaching Jesus, and his major points of disputes with the Jewish leaders wasn't over whether Jesus was real or whether Jesus had died, but over the fact that Jesus had been raised. And Paul was also put to death sometime in the 60s. So James and Paul both scorned the idea that Jesus was the Messiah until what happened? Until they encountered him raised from the dead. And after that, both men were transformed into confident leaders of the early church, and both were willing to undergo violent deaths for those claims. Now, between the disciples' early eyewitness testimony and their resolve unto death for those claims, most skeptics, this is important, most skeptics do not deny that early Christians really believed they had seen Jesus resurrected. There are very few even skeptical scholars who will now say, yeah, the disciples made the whole thing up. The burden of evidence is just too heavy for that. Listen to what Paula Fredrickson, she's a distinguished historian and scholar, listen to what she says. I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. That's what they say. And then all the historic evidence we have afterwards attests to their conviction that that's what they saw. I'm not saying they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw. But I do know that as a historian, that they must have seen something. Many other skeptics, like Marco Marina, he denies the resurrection, but he admits the disciples must have had some sort of encounter that made them really believe they had seen Jesus. Bart Ehrman again affirms this, to quote, "The disciples originally believed Jesus had been raised." In his book, The Historical Figure of Jesus, there's a liberal scholar by the name of E.P. Sanders, and he concludes this, that Jesus' followers and later Paul had resurrection experiences is, in my judgment, a fact. What the reality was that gave rise to the experiences, I don't know. So historians, even skeptical ones, can't deny the disciples really encountered something. The only question is, what? Now, some have claimed what's called the hallucination theory to explain these encounters. The hallucination theory posits that Jesus didn't really rise from the dead, but his followers were just so brokenhearted about his death that they all suffered these vivid hallucinations of him afterwards. You know, like if your beloved grandmother dies, and then a couple weeks later you wake up and you think you heard her talking to you. You're so broken with grief that you have what seems like a really lifelike encounter with this person that you loved. But the hallucination theory is inadequate for several reasons, and I'll just list three. One, hallucinations are visions, not interactions. Hallucinations are visions, not interactions. The early Christians did not merely claim to have seen Jesus. They didn't just say, I thought I saw him walk by, or I think I maybe heard his voice while I was half asleep, or I spotted him up on a hilltop. They claimed to have touched him, to have eaten with him. They claimed to have put their fingers in the scars in his wrists. They claimed to have sat there with him, talked with him, watched him eat food, to have physically touched him and spoken with him. So it wasn't just the claim of a vision, but an actual physical interaction. Secondly, hallucinations happen to individuals, not large groups. Hallucinations happen to individuals, not large groups. By definition, a hallucination is a personal, internal misperception of something that's not really there. Hallucinations are caused by chemical reactions in the brain, and they occur privately in someone's brain. Now, there are certainly many cases of mass hysteria or mass delusion, but something as psychologically specific as a hallucination is not a shared experience. And even if certain people have a similar kind of experience, they are not the exact same experience, nor are they shared by hundreds of people. So hallucinations happen to individuals, not large groups. But thirdly, hallucinations of grief are not experienced by enemies. The claim that the early witnesses experienced these hallucinations because they were so grieved over Christ's death cannot account for the Apostle Paul. Paul hated Jesus. He hated Jesus' followers. He wanted to eradicate the church. The hallucination theory cannot adequately explain why Paul saw and interacted with Jesus. And so overall, this theory just can't explain all these resurrection encounters. So let's have our conclusion. Let's put all these pieces together. 1, Jesus really died. 2, Jesus was really buried. 3, the tomb was really empty. 4th, many eyewitnesses claim to have seen him alive and interacted with him. And 5th, those eyewitnesses were all willing to suffer excruciating fates for those claims, including some of his former enemies. What makes the most fitting sense of all those puzzle pieces? I don't think any theory can adequately explain them other than the one thing that many of us would rather not believe, and that is that Jesus really rose from the dead. Now, why are we so resistant to that possibility? Why do we entertain all these other implausible theories and not go with the one that makes the best sense of all the pieces? Because if it's not true, if Jesus didn't really rise, then we can relegate him as just another footnote in the history books. If Jesus didn't really rise, then he's someone that we perhaps admire, but not someone we need to submit to. But if the resurrection happened, then the gospel's true. Jesus is who he said he is. And if it's true, then that means God really exists. We have really sinned against him, and we really have a responsibility to repent and turn to Christ, and we really have an eternal destiny hanging over us. That is very unpleasant news that many of us would rather not think about. So we'd rather take it on blind faith and just say, I don't know how to explain it, but I still won't believe it. But if we go where the evidence leads, and we're willing to accept that, then what we actually have at the same time is the best possible news. Because if it's true, and if Jesus really rose, then that means God really loves us enough to send his own son to really die for us. It means Jesus really is alive and has really conquered death. And it means that we really can have forgiveness for our sins and eternal life freely and graciously offered to us. It might be unpleasant because if it's true, it's going to cost us everything. But there is cause for embracing it with much rejoicing, because if it's true, if we follow where the evidence leads and we admit that it's true, then we have been given absolutely everything. Praise God for this amazing gift.